Well, welcome back to Bigger Platform Podcast. I'm Ashby Foote. I'm delighted to have as our guest today for a second visit with us, Douglas Carswell, who's the CEO of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. Douglas, great to have you on board today.
Thank you for having me back. It's wonderful to be here.
Okay, for our listeners who have not heard Douglas before, he doesn't sound like he grew up in Mississippi, and sure enough, he did not. He came here from Britain, and has an exciting story to tell just on those lines there. Can you briefly tell us how you got to Mississippi in the past, 12 months and what, struck you as a reason to come here?
I have been in Mississippi just over a year. Before I came to Mississippi, I was a member of the British Parliament. I was elected 4 times. I won every time I sought re-election, but I went into politics in Britain to do what we today call Brexit, to get Britain out of the European Union. And after we won that, I thought I'd had enough of British politics, and I wanted to come and do something for the liberty movement in America. And I thought, where better to come than the South? Everyone in the world knows that the South is the best bit of America, and what could be better than the most southerly state in the Union, Mississippi?
Well, thank you for saying that. Those are kind words, and it's great to have you. And I have to, tip my hat to the extraordinary triumph of the Brexit movement. To talk about a long shot political movement, that is really amazing that you were able to succeed in that. My hat's off to you. I think it's great. It's great to see politics overcome the status quo in such a dramatic way.
It's only one example where the opinions of the elite are profoundly wrong. And fortunately on Brexit, the people were able to correct that misguided elite opinion. But I think, as we're about to discover, there are a whole range of issues, not least energy policy, where the elite are also delusional. And we need to talk about what we can do to correct their delusions when it comes to fossil fuels too.
Exactly. And that the catalyst for inviting Douglas to come back with us to Bigger Platform was exactly that. The energy crisis, the electricity crisis, is now underway in the United Kingdom in a serious way, but it's also happening in the Eurozone as well. And we thought, who better to ask than to talk about the policy environment in Britain today and the problems that are coming from that policy environment. I think part of it's due to policy. Then Douglas Carswell, who's been in the House of Commons.
Yeah, I think if anyone wants an example of how not to run your country's energy policy, Europe provides the perfect example of how not to do it. The 2 most appalling examples of energy policy in the world, without exception, are Britain and Germany. It's a toss-up as to which one is in a weaker position. But these are entirely man-made problems, public policy problems that have basically shot those countries' economies in the foot. And it is quite extraordinary how badly misjudged policymaking has been. And I think America should look at it as an example of what not to do. I think the whole world needs to look at British energy policy as an example of what not to do. But it really is extraordinary what is happening in Britain today.
Well, before we get into the nitpicking, or not the nitpicking, but the finer points of the British policy right now that has led to this, I think one of the great ironies is that as it comes to energy and power, is that Great Britain has been at the vanguard of fossil fuels and the Industrial Revolution. And what's one of the ironies is that you were Great Britain was, or the UK was, the ground zero for the Industrial Revolution. It was driven to a large degree by fossil fuels. At least it was extended by fossil fuels. And I think if I'm not mistaken, I think that a lot of it had to do with the policies in place way back in the 1700s and the 1800s that allowed that to begin with some of the great.
Well, everyone says England was the home of the Industrial Revolution, and actually that's only partly true.
Okay.
If you look at the process of economic specialization and exchange that was the essential precursor of industrial takeoff, I would say Northern Italy and particularly the Dutch Republic.
Really? Okay.
I would say the Industrial Revolution really started in the Dutch Republic. But the difference is that the Dutch could only rely on the energy source in the form of wind. They tried to some extent to exploit natural peat, but you can't really get far with an Industrial Revolution based on peat. So what they tried to do was, as we all know, the Dutch built windmills. But again, you can't really power an industrial society, as we're also about to rediscover, using wind power. The Dutch tried this. The reason why people think the English led the world's first industrial revolution is because the English not only had their industrial revolution, they had access to fossil fuel to take it to the next level. That's what explains why the English industrial revolution overshadowed all the economic developments that had happened in Western Europe, and why England's economy took off. It's a fossil fuel powered. It's the riddle was not the know-how to create the machinery. It was, where is the cheap source of energy? Before the English Industrial Revolution, as I said, the Dutch had some wind. In England, the early Industrial Revolution used water power, and that was a sort of limited textile version of the Industrial Revolution in the Pennines. But the real whoosh takeoff was when the Brits discovered this thing called coal. And it was this marvelous source of cheap energy. And we talk about fossil fuel. I think it's important to also remember what fossil fuel really is. It's basically stored solar power. People today on the radical left of this debate will say to you, we need solar power. Well, what do they think coal is? It is stored solar power. Solar power, which landed on the surface of the Earth millions of years ago, has been stored in the form of coal and oil and shale gas. And when we use that, we are really ultimately using energy that derives from the sun. And the English were successful because they were able to tap into this source of energy, coal, and they were able to create this extraordinary industrial takeoff. And the English per capita GDP rose, standards of living. If you look at a chart showing living standards around the world, they take off round about 1800. And that is because of this new source of cheap energy. It is a huge event in the elevation of the human condition. Up until that moment, pretty much every society had ever lived had been poor. Once the Industrial Revolution, fueled by fossil fuels, this new energy source comes along, that is when we begin the march towards a world of iPhones and science and technology and jet travel and all the modern miracles we have around us.
So the density of the energy in coal and oil and gas is what amplified the human efforts that in the machinery that then took off with the Industrial Revolution and created everything from the steam engine from Thomas Newcomen. And
it's a profound problem. How do you get the energy source? Now, the answer for most powers, most societies in human history was brute human brawn. And what they did is they created vast armies of forced labor, slavery, and they used human muscle as an energy source. And that was not a terribly good or moral way of arranging a society. Once you got the Industrial Revolution, machinery, you could free human society from the need to use either horsepower or human power to achieve all the things that we need to do in order to have the standard of living that we want to have. It was a miracle. And what extraordinary nonsense it is today to listen to politicians in Britain and in the United States talking about the Industrial Revolution as though it was a bad thing. It was a great leap forward in human progress, and a wonderful thing too. It's what set us free. It's what literally allowed societies for the first time in human history to abolish slavery. It's what allowed people to ensure that agricultural workers no longer had to work every waking hour to eke out a living. It's what allows us as humans to have long weekends and long holidays. It's this most extraordinary thing, the energy revolution, and it's the root cause of the Industrial Revolution, and it's the key driver of the great 200 years of human progress that we've had.
Thank you. That's a great explanation and great insight. You only have to go back about 300 years to, there's this great romance with renewable fuels right now, primarily wind and solar. But you only have to go back 300 years to get to a point where 99% of the fuel that humanity used was renewable. And they were struggling to get by and just make ends meet during that time period.
There are lots of examples of societies that had zero carbon emissions and wonderfully environmentally friendly energy policies. They were horrible places to live. Medieval Europe was very environmentally friendly, but they literally had so little energy that the few places that were able to create windmills were considered great epicenters of technology. I mean, if you have a society that is energy poor, pretty much everything else in that society will be poor too. You will be short of food. Much of our fertilizer that we use to create the extraordinary yields that we have that allows us to enjoy cheap, plentiful food, much of that comes from the exploitation of oil, fossil fuels. If you look at the everyday products we have around us, it would be unimaginable that we would have cheap clothing and cheap cars and cheap travel and all the other cheap things we have if we didn't have cheap energy. It's absolutely elemental to our living standards.
And I think a lot of people don't realize that as we progressed and got better at utilizing the fossil fuels, it freed up other things. The whales were saved primarily by the advent of kerosene, a derivative of coal.
Yeah.
And until then, there was a thriving whaling industry that threatened to basically wipe out the whales.
Yeah.
But in the 1840s, along came kerosene, and pretty much put the whaling business out of business. And they were primarily in the pursuit of the whale oil, which was the best form of illumination at that time until.
If you read Moby Dick, and I wonder why are these guys risking life and limb to catch this wretched whale? Well, it's because they needed the blubber, the fat, for the light. It was very, very valuable. Along comes the Industrial Revolution, and suddenly you don't need to hunt whales anymore. I mean, there are other reasons why some countries continue to hunt whales, but you didn't need to do it from an industrial point of view. But it's the everyday things that energy and cheap energy has made possible. In London, about 120 years ago, there were over 150,000 women who worked as washerwomen. That is to say, they earned their living by going door to door, taking people's dirty clothing and washing it. And it was a horrible, miserable way of earning a living. They would, if you look at the skeletal remains of those who worked as washerwomen to this day, you can see evidence of it by the damage to their knees as they spent so long on stone floors, the damage it did to their hands. It was a horrible way of earning a living. There are no washerwomen in London today. Why? Because of something called a washing machine. Washing machines are only possible because we have cheap and plentiful electricity. Everywhere you look, you see how cheap energy and the machine revolution that it's made possible has elevated the human condition. And it's a wonderful thing. It's extraordinary that we should be led by people today on both sides of the Atlantic who think that cheap energy is something to be ashamed of. It's not.
Right. I agree. So the Industrial Revolution succeeds and builds tremendous, advances in human quality of life and civilization. And then in the late 1800s, we have electricity and electrical lighting, and Thomas Edison is at the forefront of that, and he creates, he and other inventors create the electrical grid, and that becomes the most important infrastructure system that humanity had ever come up with, as far as increasing not only quality of life, but the flourishment of mankind, the ability to flourish.
And the ability to move energy source from one location to another. Before then, you could ship coal around or firewood around, but it was cumbersome and difficult. Once you get the grid, you can transport energy from one place to another, from the Colorado Dam to Los Angeles or wherever. Yeah.
So and now we find ourselves, so let's flash forward to 2020, and 140 years after we got started on the electrical revolution and the electric grid, and we find ourselves in the UK, just to for the people who may not be aware of it, there have been serious crises brewing over there for about the last 4 or 5 months. Yeah. Price of natural gas in Britain has gone up over 400% in the last 14 months. And it's it's really thrown the electrical system as they know it, into turmoil, both there and also in the Germany as well. So here's, what we wanted to get to is talk about how is it that a country that was, in the vanguard of the Industrial Revolution, participated in the electric grid and everything else, how can it get so gummed up? by, I assume, policy played a role in that.
And it's an entirely government-created, public policy-created problem. The laws of physics haven't changed in Britain to suddenly make energy unaffordable. Several things have happened, but the overarching problem is that policymakers have decided that energy should be produced using renewable sources. I mean, there are basically 3 or 4 ways you can generate cheap energy. You can generate energy by burning either coal or gas or oil, or you can generate it using nuclear power, or you can generate it using so-called renewables. Now, the fundamental problem that Britain is in is that successive governments it really started under the last Labour government going back over a decade, but it's been perpetuated and made worse by the current government, which is notionally conservative. And it's been made worse by the government basically requiring energy to be produced using renewable sources rather than fossil fuels, in the mistaken belief that the emission of carbon dioxide, which is essentially plant food, that the emission of carbon dioxide is paramount. The reduction in the emission of carbon dioxide is paramount. Now, there are all sorts of arguments you can have as to whether or not the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is what people claim it is. But let's accept at face value their claims that we need to reduce the amount of carbon emissions. If you were to do this by subsidizing the use of renewable energy, which is what they've done, and requiring people and requiring producers to produce energy using renewable methods, and to make it much more difficult, and by phasing out coal-powered stations, by failing to renew nuclear-powered stations, you end up with the situation we have now, which is where there's not enough energy available in the UK, and so we end up in a situation where we're dependent upon either Putin's Russia to supply us with gas. Britain's not, fortunately, quite in the situation of dependency that Germany is. We're in a sense at the end of the pipeline, so our situation is not as grave as Germany's. But Britain is now in the ridiculous situation of having to have liquefied natural gas containers from America sent across the Atlantic to supply Britain with gas, with energy, which Britain could have produced using the shale gas reserves that she's sitting on. And the reason why we're forced to buy American-produced shale gas is because we've had a moratorium on the production of shale gas in the UK. So stop and think, why is it any better in terms of carbon dioxide emissions reduction for us to be using an energy source produced from American shale gas rather than UK shale gas? It's by their own objective measures of the policymakers, a ridiculous and ludicrous situation they've got us into. America is in a much stronger position because you haven't yet had the moratorium on shale gas that we had in Britain. Britain is blessed not only to have been the home of vast amounts of coal reserves, which are still there, there are huge amounts of coal reserves in the UK, we are also doubly blessed to be sitting on this huge, vast amount of shale gas reserve. But there is a government moratorium that specifically prevents companies from utilizing that. So we're having to import gas from American shale gas producers, and Putin's Russia, because of the moratorium that we have produced to prevent shale gas being produced in the UK ourselves.
Are there any efforts within the government to change that moratorium?
Unfortunately, I don't think the politicians will see the light until the lights go out, if I can put it that way. I think that the level of analysis at the upper echelons of government is so mediocre and so lacking in any signs of intellectual vitality that we're literally at a situation where we walked into an energy crisis before people wake up to the reality that our energy policy has been wrong. Under the previous government, Theresa May, a price cap was created, and this was a government law that prevented energy companies from charging customers more than a certain amount for their energy bills.
This is for like their electricity.
Yeah.
Okay.
The price cap said to the energy companies, you're not allowed to charge your consumers more than a certain amount, this energy price cap. Now, of course, you don't need to be a genius to work out that when the costs of generating that electricity go up, you have the mass bankruptcy of British energy companies. Many of them have gone bankrupt simply because they're unable to pass on the increase in costs that they themselves face to their consumers. So the government is using government regulation to make a situation of its own making worse. The reason why the energy companies are having to put their costs and their production costs are going up is because they're not allowed to generate electricity from the cheapest available source, which is fossil fuels. So, having mandated the producers not to use fossil fuels, the costs of generating electricity have gone up. They can't pass those costs on to the consumers. The companies go bust. It's the sort of thing you would have expected in some sort of banana republic in the 70s. And it's really quite shocking to see the British Conservative Party, the party of Margaret Thatcher, embark on quite such an economically asinine policy.
It is, particularly when you think when you think about the father of modern economics is considered Adam Smith, who was all about free markets and the invisible hand. It's as if they don't want to believe what Adam Smith had to say 250 years ago.
There's an element also of geopolitics in this. I mean, Ronald Reagan, who I think is one of the great American presidents, I remember this as a kid growing up. I wasn't really into politics at the time, but I remember him very clearly saying, around about the time he stood down, that Western Europe should be very careful about becoming dependent upon the Soviet Union. It was the Soviet system at the time, the Soviet Union for gas. And he warned about this, and pretty much everything he warned about has come to pass. Western Europe, particularly Germany, has phased out nuclear power, stopped using coal, built lots of windmills, which are not very effective when the wind isn't blowing, invested heavily in solar paneling, solar power, which is not particularly good if you're a Northern Hemisphere country with the climate of Germany.
Yeah, much sunshine. I mean, it's...
And both wind and solar power require battery capacity to store it, and they simply don't have the battery capacity that they need. I mean, it's absurd. So they've got this massive gap, this energy gap, and so they turn to their neighbor to their east, Putin's Russia, and are now dependent upon Putin's Russia for energy. And it's exactly what Ronald Reagan warned about.
Wow. Now let me dive a little deeper into you talked about the number of electricity providers that have gone out of business because of the price cap. And I understand that come February, there's some panel or group or authority that has to relook at the pricing, and they'll probably jack prices up significantly in February to the consumers. And I guess that might help bail out the providers. But in the meantime, a lot of them, my question is really, how is Britain's electrical system, or the electrical part of the production, delivery, transmission set up? In the United States, we have a lot of different ways, and some of them are, I think, good. Some of them could improve a lot. But I don't know that we have price caps like Britain does. So how is it they're set up?
Britain is in this ludicrous situation of having a government-mandated price cap. The government is going to have to allow that cap to go up. So having chosen to go into the business of price controls, the government is now going to be massively blamed for price controls. I mean, we ought to be allowing the pricing mechanism to allocate finite resources. If you had a free market in energy, energy producers would have naturally shifted production to cheaper sources. They would be using coal and oil and liquefied natural gas, particularly shale gas. Because of government intervention that prevents that, we're now in this situation where the government is going to be blamed by ordinary voters for allowing prices to go up. Whereas had they chosen to allow the free market to do it, the government wouldn't be deemed liable and responsible for that. And to put it very crudely, Britain has a national grid, which is a very well developed, we're quite a small area. Geographically, England is about the size of Mississippi, so Britain is not much bigger than sort of Mississippi and Alabama combined. We've got a very good national grid that allows you to transport electricity. I mean, they're basically the division in Britain in the energy market is between producers and suppliers. Producers in Britain no longer produce energy in order to satisfy consumers by providing them with electricity at a price that they're willing to pay. Producers in Britain have for nearly a decade now produced in compliance with what they're mandated to produce. And you have this system of cross-subsidy where they will, in effect, be cross-subsidizing the inefficient and expensive production of energy using wind and solar. They're mandated to produce a certain proportion of their overall generating capacity from renewables, and so that jacks up the price of everything else for this sort of cross-subsidy system. So producers basically produce what the minister and the government in London want them to produce. The problem is that the distributors, and there are lots and lots of companies that are in the business of retailing electricity, they're in the business of trying to get as many consumers as possible. The problem for them is that they have no control over the costs, and they are restricted when it comes to what they can charge the consumer. So you've literally had dozens of British energy companies going under. You now are in a situation where it's winter. Mercifully, it's not been a severe winter in the UK, but there is a very precarious situation in Britain where, the people who measure the amount of electricity on the national grid face the real prospect that we will have power cuts.
Now, there's also issues with businesses that there's plenty of businesses out there that use lots of electricity as a feed as to generate their products.
Mm-hmm.
And that's got to be tough on them as well. If they're trying to compete on the global scale, and your cost of electricity is twice or three times what their competitors across the ocean are, it's going to be hard pressed to stay in business as a business.
There are some industries such as aluminum production or fertilizer production that are very, very energy intensive. And what you see is basically European operations in those areas being shut down now. I mean, Europe is basically, because of its high energy costs, has priced itself out of the world markets as a producer in those high energy intensive. But it's not just that. Take, for example, we would call them potato crisps. I think you call them chips here. When you make a packet of potato chips, you use energy. The producers of everyday household foods have high energy costs, and so what do? They pass those costs on to the consumer. So you see inflation in the UK for a multiplicity of reasons, but one of the reasons is because energy costs for everyday production processes are going up. Europe is in danger of pricing itself out of the world economy and basically becoming a museum. Yes, it may have been the home to the world's first industrial revolution, and there may have been some wonderful architecture built in Europe, but is Europe really going to be the home of any industrial innovation or technological game-changing if it's prohibitively expensive to run a business there? I mean, we see in the United States how California, with its high energy costs, Tesla relocates from California to Texas. At least in America, you have different systems within the United States that allow people to move to avoid the consequences of bad policy making on the West Coast. What do you do in Europe when so much of your approach is done at a European level, when the pricing of European energy producers out of the market has been done at a pan-European level? I think what you see is the deindustrialization of Europe. I mean, this is really, really going to clobber German industry.
That's really amazing. I appreciate that insight. It's interesting that you bring up California and Texas, because they had their challenges with their electric grid in both states.
Yeah.
California's had a number last year. They had a number of brownouts and blackouts across the state, and I think they have the highest penetration of solar power in their state, because they made have had offer generous subsidies for renewables. And then in Texas, they have the highest penetration of wind power.
Mm-hmm.
And even though they're considered a conservative state, they went whole hog into solar. I mean, not into solar, but into the windmills.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a terrible situation that arose back in February of a year ago, that big storm, and they shut down the grid for a while.
They also had a closed grid just in Texas, and that was the root cause of the problem. I mean, if California is a very good example of how not to produce energy, I would say Texas is probably a pretty good example of how not to distribute it. Don't create a standalone grid and then have an ice storm. It's not a good recipe.
Right. So let's transition from, I don't know that we can solve the problem here. We can go back and talk about that later on, but because it's hard to know how the politicians will try to navigate through this. Maybe it takes a calamity in order to rearrange the system there, but it certainly sounds very intractable at this point in time.
I mean, I think the key guide should be not to make policy on the assumption that you know what the future looks like. It could be that we are on the cusp of all sorts of technological and innovative changes, which means that, for example, you could have such cheap battery storage capacity and so many improvements in solar cell technology that it would be perfectly possible to have lots of homes in the southern United States generate their own electricity and store it, in the carport or the garage or whatever. It may be that that's completely misguided, and that actually the future lies in having vast new nuclear power stations. In Britain, interestingly, they're talking about creating lots of small micro nuclear power.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, that's a step in the right direction.
Well, I mean, put it another way, they're so desperate because of the mess they've got themselves into, they're going to Rolls-Royce, which makes our big nuclear submarines, and basically saying to Rolls-Royce, instead of making a nuclear engine for a submarine, can you create a little nuclear generator that can subsidize, can be a sort of substitute power plant? And Rolls-Royce is looking to create a whole new series of mini nuclear generators using the technology that powers our submarines. But who knows what the future might look like? The problem has been that politicians have decided they know, and there are all sorts of technologies that are potentially interesting. I mean, don't give up on solar. Solar is going to be, I think, important, particularly in states that have countries that have a lot of sun. But we get into a mess when politicians decide that they know what the future is going to look like, and they issue rules that favor one outcome over another. And we just don't know. A sensible approach to energy would be to deregulate, to remove many of the requirements imposed upon generators in the name of reducing carbon emissions, and to allow different producers to find different ways to produce cheap electricity. Nuclear, I think, is certainly going to be part of the mix. I think shale gas is definitely got to be a big part of the mix. And if you're going to have fossil fuels, and I can't see a future without fossil fuels, if you're going to have fossil fuels, shale gas is probably a cleaner way of doing it than burning brown coal. But the key to this is not to suppose that we know today what tomorrow should look like.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. And one of the things that I see as a big issue in this is you have politicians at the national or global level, in some cases, doing subsidies in such a way that they're allocating capital rather than the market allocating capital. And to the extent of not only restricting, what the oil companies can do or whatever for new projects and long-term resources for their oil reserves, but subsidizing the wind and solar, and it's being basically forced on the countries in a way that is could be disastrous for their economic future.
When I was a member of Parliament in Britain, I remember being approached by some lobbyists lobbying in favour of wind turbines, and they came along to me and were lobbying in favour of wind turbines, and I had a conversation with them, and they said, actually, these wind turbines are going to be built out at sea, so there's no one around them is going to object. So I then said, so why are you coming to me? Why does it need permission? If they're such a good idea, why do you need taxpayer money to help you to build them? And when they actually get down to the nitty-gritty of the financing of it, it's very clear that very few of those giant wind turbines would have been built if the free market had been allowed to decide on it. They're built because they're built by subsidy. And when people build a solar farm, they call it, they're really farming not the sun's rays to generate electricity, they're farming subsidy. And that's the root cause of so much of the problem that Britain is in.
I agree completely on that. So let's transmit back to the U.S. here. Because the U.S. is dealing with this, and it's my concern or my that what we may be seeing is Britain and the UK and Germany may be the canary in the coal mine for all these renewables. I mean, the renewables in the case of building windmills and solar farms, your fuel may be free, sunshine and wind, but it's not dispatchable like a gas plant or a nuclear plant is, where you can just turn it on and it goes on.
For a long period, when America was, and it's the number one economy in the world, America had an Achilles heel, and that was dependence upon imports of energy. America had to be nice to all sorts of nasty people in the Middle East because America was dependent upon oil from Saudi Arabia and other countries. Now, this was a problem that I think bedeviled many American presidents for a generation or two, until someone discovered how to extract gas using fracking, shale gas. It meant that America has, for the first time really since the industrial takeoff of America in the sort of 1870s, 1880s, that America is no longer a net importer of energy. She's actually an exporter. There is technology and infrastructure that was built to import gas in New Orleans and other American ports that is now been reversed to export gas. The shale gas revolution means that America is in a much, much, much better place. So I think the first thing to do is to make sure that the shale gas as a resource, nothing is done to inhibit that as a resource. America would be in a real mess if they were dependent, like they were 20, 30 years ago, on oil from the Middle East. So make sure that the people who do fracking are allowed to carry on fracking. They should be regarded as heroes who've kept America free and safe. I think it's fair to say that the current government, by cancelling various pipelines, is not in favour of using the fossil fuel resources. I'm hoping that the example of Europe would make them think seriously and think twice. A few months ago, there was a global summit on the environment in Glasgow. And Boris Johnson was at that summit, and he waxed lyrically about Britain is determined that we'll be the first nation to achieve net zero. This is an elimination. For most of human history, most countries were on net zero, and they were pretty grim and poor places. If Britain is really serious about achieving net zero, we're going to be the first industrial advanced economy to tank ourselves and go back to the Stone Age. I don't think that will happen, because I think people are beginning to see the consequences of that folly. Now, also attending that conference was Joe Biden. I suspect that there are people in the White House today who are a lot less enthusiastic on pursuing that virtue signaling glib made for Twitter agenda that they were pursuing at the Glasgow summit, now that they can see the real actual consequences of that green agenda.
Excellent points. Let me talk about I want to talk first about the America's electrical grid, and then Mississippi and the policies that you might have an influence on, and Bigger Pie might try to weigh in on. We've weighed in on the electrical policies, electric generation and delivery policies with the Public Service Commission in the past. And I've got this came from a book, A Question of Power. It's all about the electrical system. And it's basically a table that says America's Crazy Quilt Electrical Grid. And it says, facts are from 2016. The United States had 189 investor-owned utilities that had 88 million customers. They had 2,013 publicly owned utilities with 21 million customers. They had 877 cooperatives with 19 million customers. Then they had 218 power marketers with 6 million customers. And then they had 9 federal power agencies with 39,000 customers, for a total of 3,306 electricity providers. So it may be that we're fortunate to have such a dispersed group that it makes it harder for the federal government to control everything, because it's just the way it's developed through the middle of the 20th century, which is really kind of where, from the 1920s to the 1950s, is when they really were able to, get out and build the grid out and meet the needs of, or provide electricity to about 99% of the population. And of course, so we've got a bunch of different layers. We've got FERC at the federal level, we've got the PSC here, and then you've got public utility commissions, and you got unique organizations like in Texas, where they had a public utility commission where all of the public utility commissioners got fired after, or they quit after the storm last year. It hurt them so bad. So, one of the things at Bigger Pie we don't want to see is a situation in the UK where suddenly, prices go through the roof and they're out of control.
And you see here in Mississippi, and remind me of the detail, but you've had examples here of people trying to subsidize particular sources of power generation.
Right.
There's that very famous case.
About the Kemper project?
Yes.
Yeah. That was where it was subsidized at the federal level. Yeah. They got tax credits from the federal level, and it was promoted heavily by many elected officials. It ended up not working, and fortunately, they had not been granted prudence. This was run by a Mississippi Power, subsidiary of Southern Company, and they ended up having to eat the $6 billion write-off, and not the consumers in the Mississippi Power Service area. Mm-hmm. But we are, one of the things that has gotten both Europe and UK, California, and Texas is this heavy build out of renewables, and that are intermittent. And so you can't just turn them on like people are used. Yeah. People expect, they take it for granted that the electricity is going to work when they go over in the morning and turn it on. Yeah. They expect that. They do not want to have to wait for the wind to pick up before they turn on their lights.
I mean, most sources of renewable, solar and wind, are solar. You don't need to be a genius to work out it's kind of better at some times of the day than others. But even during daytime, if you've got thick cloud cover and different times of year, so it's not dependable, and neither is wind particularly dependable. You get windy days and still days. So if you're going to increase the percentage of your energy from those sources, you have to figure out how to store it, and it's a question of math. We simply don't have anything like the capacity to store the kind of volume of energy that we need to become more dependent on it. I mean, it doesn't matter what politicians want to happen.
It's physics.
It's physics.
It really is.
I think in Mississippi there's also an issue, not just with politicians sometimes subsidizing various power sources, is consumers in Mississippi don't have real power when it comes to getting energy. Mississippi's are broken down into a mosaic of little fiefdoms.
Yeah.
And if you live in that fiefdom, your feudal energy overlord will supply you with what they're willing to give you, and it's take it or leave it. And of course, you have to take it. Now, there's a theoretical mechanism where you can hold them to account, but it's a cartel. There's no polite word for it. We have an energy cartel here that denies the consumers real choice and real power. So I think we need to ask ourselves, what can we do to allow consumers in Mississippi to switch provider? Now, some people would say that's not physically possible because there's only one distribution grid. It's perfectly possible to have one grid but have different suppliers. Sure. That's perfectly possible. But I think if Mississippi wants to create a genuine market so that consumers can switch from one provider to another, they need to make absolutely certain they don't make the mistake that the Brits made with that model, where you end up with a free market when it comes to choosing your supplier, but it's a Soviet-type system when it comes to energy production. You need a free market with both.
Fascinating. That's a good point. And the right now we have two of the publicly traded companies that have service areas: Mississippi Power down in southeast Mississippi, and then Entergy in the western side, that shares the Grand Gulf plant, which is a nuclear plant, with Louisiana and Arkansas. But we also have lots of co-ops, and then we have the corner of the state, northeast corner of the state is TVA, which
Tennessee Valley Authority.
Tennessee Valley Authority, which is
Thank you, FDR.
That's right. So there's lots on our plate, but I guess my concern is if the lessons that are being learned over in these different places, UK and Europe, about intermittent fuel sources like wind and solar, we should are as challenging as we've seen, particularly in the last 6 months here with the energy crisis and both the electricity crisis in both those places. We need to be very, very careful about going ahead and making big investments, and the commitment for the consumers to underwrite those investments for 20, 30 years into the future.
I worry about the federal government, possibly even the state government, but certainly the federal government, giving subsidies to producers to produce energy from so-called renewable sources, and the producers to do so because they're interested in getting hold of the subsidies, without thinking about long-term what this means for the consumer, not just the dependability of the electricity supply, but the long-term cost. Because we still don't live in a world where anyone has figured out how to make energy more cheaply than you can make it by burning fossil fuel, and that's a fact. So if you move dependence from fossil fuel, costs will go up. There's no getting away from that. In a normal market, the producers and the energy companies would be on the side of the consumer. But the problem is, because of the way that the cartel works in a state like Mississippi, the consumer is really an afterthought in all of this. If you think that the Mississippi energy market is a free market and it's sustained by satisfied consumers, just ask yourself, why do all these energy companies have so many lobbyists buzzing around Jackson and DC? You only need to buy political advantage if you can't have happy customers. So I think there's a real risk of the producers. It's like a sort of Ayn Rand novel, take out the word railroad and put in energy supplier. There's a real risk of the energy companies getting into cahoots through lobbyists with the federal government, cooking up ways to produce energy inefficiently and ultimately passing those costs on to the consumer.
Yeah, I mean, there's energy, and then there's fuels, and then there's electricity. So you're primarily the Public Service Commission is more talking with, they're overseeing the electricity producers, and the questions come down to which fuels should be the best ones to use. And sadly, the ones that are being subsidized are ones that have to be subsidized because they're not as effective as natural gas, let's say. And so we end up with big announcements. They're going to build a new, not necessarily windmills in Mississippi so much, but solar farms, even though they're intermittent, and you have to have backup because you can't just turn them on. So you end up with having to have more capacity.
I would be absolutely in favor of solar if it didn't require a dime of public subsidy.
Yeah.
But the fact that it needs massive cross-subsidy and public subsidy, I think should caution us. These can't be viable. I mean, just imagine if you needed a federal subsidy every time you bought an iPhone. There is a technology that has changed our lives for the better. It's affordable. Everyone can use it. Ask yourself, if this technology to produce energy using solar was so wonderful, why do you need to subsidize it?
Good question. You talking about this? There was a couple of them that were really funny. Why is UK facing an energy crisis? How do we cope with it? And here, I found this interesting here. And this shows how far away from the principles of free markets that they've gotten to in Britain, and I think that, in many ways Mississippi's farther away from the free markets than they ought to be, than I wish they were, put it that way. And so, I've got another article here I came across, Douglas, that I think is fascinating. The title is, "Why is the UK facing an energy crisis and how do we cope with it?" And it says, "What to expect in the coming months." And it goes on to say that the UK's energy crisis deepened last week, and this is in late December, and the gas market prices surpassed the record highs set in October to reach a new all-time high of 4.5 pounds per therm. Now, I'm not sure what therm is. That's a term that y'all use that we don't use. 9 times higher than the same time a year ago, which is remarkable that you could have a commodity like that. It is a commodity, go up by 9-fold in price. That's devastating to the whole marketplace. Somebody gets caught there, and it looks like the people that are providing with the price cap are the ones who are going out of business now because of this. And then it goes on to say that what can government do about this? It says the price cap set by the regulator Ofgem, which I'm not familiar with that term, that the average price last year was 12,777 pounds, not 12,000, 1,277 pounds a year, but it's expected to rise by 50% this coming February when Ofgem recalculates its level in April. They expect it to go up 50% by 2000. Now, if electricity prices go up by 50% in Mississippi, for a lot of the people on the bottom of the economic, totem pole, that's devastating.
Yeah.
That means they got to cut somewhere else, either groceries or medicine or something else.
But let's be clear, this massive rise in electricity prices in Britain is going to leave poor Britons making a decision of, do you keep the lights on and stay warm, or do you eat?
Yeah.
Even families that aren't in quite such a precarious position, it's going to have a pretty big impact. For anyone who runs a factory, anyone who runs a business that requires a lot of electricity, whether it's farming or food processing, it's going to have a devastating impact. Now, it might be tempting to think this is inevitable. As we come out of the lockdowns, the world economy, demand for energy goes up. Yes, of course, there would have been an increase in demand for energy, but this is not a consequence of the COVID lockdown or the end of that. This is a consequence of British government policy being spectacularly foolish. And it's spectacularly foolish because the British government has prioritized the removal of, or the elimination of energy production using fossil fuels over and above the need for cheap energy. And so we've literally made it impossible for producers to produce energy cheaply. Now, all across Western Europe, governments are scrambling around, frantically trying to get hold of gas. Some of the gas that they were depending on, or thought they could depend on, was from Mr. Putin's Russia. Now, we all know that Mr. Putin likes to play geopolitical games, and he's got his eye on annexing his neighbor, and he's using that gas pipeline as a bargaining chip. He's warning the Europeans that if you dare to not do what he wants, he's going to cut off the energy supply. And it seems to be, I'm afraid to say, working. Germany, only a few days ago, forbid Britain from flying munitions in over German airspace, which we were sending to our allies in Ukraine. Geopolitics comes into it, but it's worse than just dependence upon Putin's Russia. Britain has a contract with Qatar, a Gulf state, to supply it with liquefied natural gas. And because of that relationship, and it is a relationship between a British Prime Minister and a Sultan or whatever in a Gulf state, it means that we have privileged access to this resource. But what kind of country have we become where, in order to keep the lights on, the friendship of a Prime Minister and an unelected despot is needed to make sure we get enough natural gas? How is that something that a civilized country wants to be doing?
No,
It's an extraordinary situation where we're having to beg despots in order to keep the lights on. That is what we've been reduced to. That is the price we pay for virtue signaling at green global summits and signing up to zero carbon pledges. The price we pay of zero carbon pledges are British families going hungry and cold, and Britain having to do deals with tyrants and despots.
Wow, good point. Now, this article goes on to say that the Treasury, energy bosses have suggested the Treasury could cut bills by 5%, just 5%, by waiving the VAT rate, value-added tax rate on gas and electricity. This is just moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just folly that's the type of solution they're considering.
Yeah, I mean, the real reason why energy is unaffordable in Britain is because of government-imposed restrictions on the producers. Not taxing what they produce a little bit, reducing the tax burden on what they produce a little bit is not going to make them miraculously more affordable. Don't get me wrong, I don't think the government should be taxing energy, but I think the really important thing is the British government needs to go back 10 or 15 years and stop telling energy producers how to produce energy. If an energy producer wishes to produce energy using fossil fuels or shale gas, they should be allowed to. If the UK government really wants to tackle this problem, it needs to lift right away the moratorium on shale gas production. About 15 years ago, there were a couple of energy companies that started very successfully to produce shale gas in the northwest of Britain, in Lancashire. One I think was called Carillion. I may have got that wrong. I think it was called Carillion. And they had a couple of test wells, and they were very, very successful. And they replicated the kind of successes that American producers have had, I think, in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. For reasons that I still don't totally understand, the British government decided to ban any further fracking, and there's a moratorium on fracking. And the consequences of that foolish decision are being paid for by Britons today who can't keep their houses warm.
Is there any movement to address the fracking moratorium? Do people understand? Are there politicians out there that have making that a cause celeb?
I'm afraid that British politics is supposed to be a competition between two parties, a Labour Party, you're equivalent to the Democrats, and a Conservative Party, you're equivalent to the Republicans. But the antics of a sort of ultra-woke British Labour Party have been such that they have made themselves so unelectable. We're really only now, I'm afraid, in almost a sort of one-party state.
Is that right? Wow.
The Conservative Party can make foolish decision after foolish decision when it comes to energy policy, and there's no chance of anyone to their left proposing a credible alternative. And so I'm afraid the only way we're going to correct this is, I think, if the lights actually go out. It will take that level of crisis for ministers to wake up. I mean, I know some of the ministers involved. I know Kwasi Kwarteng. He's a very bright, articulate, erudite minister. He, I know, believes superficially in the free market. I'm not quite sure why it is there seems to be this inability to recognize the root cause of the problem. The root cause of the problem are these commitments to net zero. Britain cannot remain a rich, wealthy, prosperous country and retain its current commitments to net zero. It's one or the other.
Yeah, and that worries me about the United States, where net zero is been touted by many people in the elite, both corporate wise, government wise, and I think it is very dangerous.
I think America is at risk, but you have something we don't. You mentioned Ofwat, which was the Soviet-sounding name of the British regulator. Yeah. Now, in Britain, Ofwat's word is all-encompassing. In America, at least, you could allow maybe California to try net zero. They seem to be doing a pretty good job of trying net zero, and we can see the consequences of that.
Right.
Maybe let Texas or Mississippi or some of the southern states try something completely different. Britain doesn't have that different opportunity to try different approaches. So the follies and stupidities of the administrative class are imposed across the whole country in a way that doesn't happen in America. So I think that should give us hope. If we can keep control of energy policy at a state level and allow different states to do different things, I think that will test to destruction some of the ideas that we see in California and Britain and allow a genuine, credible alternative to emerge.
That's part of systems engineering is the desire to let failure happen at the smallest level and not put the whole system at risk for a failure at the system level. And you're right, the experiments at the state level allow us some flexibility if we choose to learn from them, and not just drive on and say that we just didn't subsidize enough, and we're just going to keep subsidizing more and more until we have
the price cap failed because the price cap was set at the wrong rate.
Right. Yeah. Well, this has been a delightful discussion, Douglas. Thank you so much.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for inviting me for some tea. I feel quite at home.
Well, we'll have to do this again. I mean, this has been very enlightening to me. I'm sure our audience will enjoy it as well. And you're really a breath of fresh air here, and I appreciate the insights you bring to any discussion, regardless of the subject.
As a Brit, I'm always a little bit nervous about talking about tax and tea at the same time, but it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. That's right. Good point. Thanks so much for listening, and please tune in again soon to Bigger Pie Forum Podcasts.